Hello and welcome to Clusters for this week. And this week our study is in 1 Samuel chapter 4, kind of the second half of verse 1 to the end of the chapter, verse 22. And in it we see the ark captured and Israel punished. Now let me put a bit of background in place as we come to chapter 4. We talk about the ark. We're not thinking about Noah's ark, but we're thinking about the ark, this chest made under God's instruction by his people after they were rescued from Egypt. They made it in the desert, and it was a box that was then covered in gold, and it contained the Ten Commandments, a jar of manna, and Aaron's staff that budded, kind of symbols of God's power and his miracles. And on it were these two kind of angelic figures, between which symbolically was the presence of God. It was called the mercy seat. And this box was really holy, so much so that they had these poles that went on rings on the side, so when you carried it, you wouldn't actually touch the box. And it symbolised the presence of God's people. Now that was carried around with them as they went through the desert and into the promised land. And they had it in the tabernacle, the tent, the kind of moving temple. And it seems to be that by the time we get to 1 Samuel, they had established a temple at a place called Shiloh. But this is before they moved the ark to Jerusalem and had built a temple there under Solomon. And so you've got this box, this holy box, symbolising the presence of God at the temple. And also, when we come to chapter 4, we will think about the context. So chapter 1, do you remember, with the calling or the prayer of Hannah and her promise to give her child to God's service. We have the birth of Samuel, but he's then given in service into the house of Eli, the priest. But if you remember, his sons Hophni and Phinehas are behaving terribly, both in their sexual behaviour and in their treatment of sacrifices. And them particularly, but maybe also the people, in a sense, are under the judgment of God. And that was seen in chapter 3, that actually, before Samuel, the word of God was absent. No visions, no words. That they were given, if you like, the silent treatment. And then at that point we come to chapter 4, and we straight into war. And it might go, well, that was a bit of a shock. But it seems that there was a border dispute, if I could put it like that, between Israel and the Philistines. At least we read in chapter 7 and verse 13 that the Philistines at that point stopped invading Israel. So I think we can assume that up to this point they were invading, and we also read later on that there were some towns that they had captured. So God's people are not in a good place with God and at war with their neighbours. And that brings us to chapter 4 of 1 Samuel. And as you go through, there are 5 questions, or maybe 6, to consider to try and get into the passage. I'll put them in the notes to this, the comments below. But here's the first question. How did the Israelites respond to the defeat in verses 1 to 3? And maybe think for ourselves, how do we respond to defeat or God's discipline? Second, why did they get the Ark of the Covenant, and what effect did it have initially in verses 4 to 6? And maybe it's a question for us to say, what are our responses to crises? And apart from directly to God, what other things are we tempted to put our confidence in? Question 3, what was the Philistines' response? And what had they heard before? Think back to Egypt. And then what happened? And this looking at verses 6 to 11. And here's a difficult question. Why did the presence of the ark not mean victory for the Israelites? On to verses 12 to 18 for question 4. What did Eli fear, and what was the effect of the news that the ark had been captured? And then 5. What was the significance of the name of the child born in verses 21 and 22? And then, having engaged with the story, to try and boil it down for us and say, what's the big point here, and what does it mean for us? I hope that's helpful, and I hope you have a great study.